Okay, today we're going to finally wrap up this last chapter on the extent of the establishment of the independent Vietnam in 1976. Was it more of a result of internal rather than external factors? Now, in the previous lesson, what we have done was that we have actually looked at the situation after the Geneva Accord in 1954 all the way until 1976, which resulted to the formation of an independent Vietnam after the Americans pulled out somewhere around in the 1973-74 period, when the Northern Vietnamese, led by the Viet Minh, actually launched a armed attack and took over the South Vietnam by force, resulted to the formation of an independent Vietnam in 1976. Okay, so what we're going to look at today is that we are going to focus on trying to understand. Okay, now we're going to analyze all the events, and now I'm going to classify them according to this idea of the analysis about what was actually happening to independence Vietnam. Was it really a result of what we call internal, or is it really a matter of external factors that was going on? Okay. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, what we're going to look at is that we are going to focus a little bit more attention on the following things. One, when we look at the communist victory and the American defeat, okay, I'm going to use this word very, very loosely. Defeat meaning that they actually pull out. But in actual fact, the Americans was actually not really, they didn't really lose. But I'm going to just for the benefit of this discussion, we're going to talk about it as a American defeat. We're going to look at it in the following manner. One, I want you to focus when we look at all the reasons and all the events that we're going to highlight later, we're going to look at it under in this manner. Is it really the Vietnamese strength? Okay, so what are the Vietnamese strength? What do they have that allows them to so-called to earn the victory of creating a what we call a communist Vietnam? The second thing that I want you to focus on is what are the American or the South Vietnamese weaknesses, which actually contributed to the victory of the communists in northern Vietnam. Now, at the background, I want you to also understand what was the following context. One, what was the internal situation that was happening in Vietnam? What was the general sentiment? Was the general sentiment among the Vietnamese people caused by, is it by the actions of the Americans and the South Vietnamese, or is it caused by the so-called the planning by the Northern Vietnamese, the communist Vietnam? So that is the internal reason. The other thing that is also very important is that external context that we're looking at, meaning what was happening at the international situation in the 1970s, how was the Cold War happening around the early 1970s, what was the context at that point of time, and that will give you a good idea on why the communists was able to gain a victory, or why is it that the Americans chose to pull out in 1970s. Okay, so first thing first, let's look at what were the key factors that contributed to the success. First, I want you to understand about the favorable situation. Now, the situation that was given to the communists was actually something that was very, very favorable. The communist act, or should I say, the communists existed in a situation that that have very favorable circumstances, which allows them to benefit from it. Firstly, they benefited from the Japanese occupation, which ended French colonialism, and the Japanese was also very busy trying to gain the support of the they were trying to gain the support of the communists because they wanted the communists to support them in fighting against future colonialism, especially in the later part when the Japanese was actually losing. Okay, the communists was given a lot of leeway to work in Vietnam, and that actually helped the communists. And if you remember, at that point of time, the communists also benefited because the Americans and the Allies were also giving them military support because they were trying to use them to fight against the Japanese. So the communists actually gained from both sides of the so-called both sides of the war. So they gained from the Allies, they also gained from the Japanese. When the Japanese surrendered, there was a period of time when the French did not come back yet, and the communists actually benefited from their power vacuum. So at that point of time, it allows the communists to establish a government, to have that first say in deciding what type of government that is to be created at the end of the Second World War. So if you look at that situation, the communists was given a head start, okay? And that head start came from the Japanese occupation of Vietnam. Now, the other favorable situation was, of course, created as a result of the weaknesses of the nationalists and also the so-called the monarchy supporters. Now, the opposition against the communists were actually very, very weak. The nationalists themselves were mostly eliminated during the war, or most of them have alienated themselves. When later, when they came back, when the French came back, they supported the French, hoping that the French will resume control over Vietnam. And that was actually a big issue for the people who do not want the French to return. So that created a weak opposition, or a so-called a common point of rally that allowed the people to support the communists. Remember, in the earlier phases, the communists was never seen as a communist. They were seen as the nationalists, the one who actually believe in uh, looking after the well-being of the people. The people did not really believe in the idea of communism. They believed that the communists were actually nationalists, people who cared for the country and wanted to work for the benefit of the people. And that was why it was able to use those favorable circumstances to win the support from the people. Okay, the next thing is, of course, the political skills of the Viet Minh. So what was it that the Viet Minh actually had? Now, the Viet Minh, like I mentioned to you just now, was that it presented itself as a non-communist force fighting for the independence of Vietnam, with a clear program of what they wanted to do for Vietnam's future development. So the Viet Minh presented itself as a legitimate force, a possible government that will be able to run the country effectively. And because it focused on looking after the well-being of the masses, they adopted a very populist approach. That means that they look after the people, what they care for, like the famine, to turn land into farm, to create food for the people, create educational reforms, teaching students, people literacy skills, creating a proper army, providing other skills like, for example, basic engineering. All these political skills allows the communists to be seen as a capable government ready to run the country. And that wins the communists a lot of support from the peasants. And that was the most important thing. The Viet Minh itself has already presented itself as a viable fighting force. It has continued to win support during the Japanese occupation. The fact that they also now possess the administrative and the political skill to run the country is also a very important tool that allows them to continue to stay in power, okay, and to continue to win the support of the people. Okay, now what was the situation that was happening that was preventing the communists from actually winning support, gaining a total independence? Now remember that we talked about the external context that was happening at that point of time. But one of the biggest issue, or one of the things that was stopping, or the external context that was stopping the Viet Minh from getting total power, was because there were internal obstacles. What were the internal obstacles? First thing was, of course, the external event, like for example, the creation of a Southern Vietnam, where there is a legitimate Southern Vietnam democratic government under Diem, and also the external factors, like for example, the development of the Cold War. Now, in the 1950s, all the way after the Geneva Accord, all the way until the 1960s, okay, the Cold War tension was actually escalating. Both the Americans and the Russians the communists and the non-communist or democratic group were busy building up and stockpiling their weapons. They are raising their arms race. They are also trying to make sure that they are trying to get as many supporters as they can. So there was this really genuine fear of the domino effect in Southeast Asia. And because of that, Vietnam was so-called integrated into a military form of a alliance known as what we call SEATO. Now, SEATO is a Southeast Asian version of NATO. NATO was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. SEATO was the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. And the whole purpose of SEATO was to put all the non-communist countries together in Southeast Asia to so-called to counter the threat of possible communism. So, for example, countries that has already succumbing to communist threat, like for example, Northern Vietnam, for example, China, for example, countries like, for example, North Korea. All these are possible obstacles that will create a communist influence and a domino effect into Southeast Asia. And therefore, with SEATO, a military so-called organization created to counter communism, American presence is actually important. And therefore, Americans took a very active role in trying to come in to try to stop communism, to stem communism. And because of all this stopping of communism, that was why Americans' involvement in Southeast Asia, especially the southern part of Vietnam, becomes intensified. So that was a key obstacle that was for the northern Vietnamese communist government. Now, another situation was that the Americans also have so-called strong regime that was presented in southern Vietnam. Now, when Bao Dai abdicated and Diem took over as the president of the democratic Vietnam, southern Vietnam, Diem himself was a fierce anti-communist, and he opposes any form of movement that support unification. He didn't want to have the communists to come on board. He hated Ho Chi Minh, and he doesn't want the whole country to come together as a communist country. Now, when we talk about the situation that was happening at that point of time, so South Vietnam remained staunchly anti-communist. And then there were also unpopular support from the wealthy landowners who used to support the communists. They also started to run away from the communists. The establishment of the communists was that they created things like, for example, the land reform program. And this land reform program was actually introduced in the 1956 in order to reduce income differences. However, as I mentioned, the policy of the communists was that it actually looked after the well-being of the poor peasants who do not have land. And as a result of the land reform program that was created, it has the inevitable or unintended impact of portraying that the communists was actually a dangerous group of people against landowners, and many of the landowners actually started to go against them. So there was some form of opposition against the Ho Chi Minh's government in the northern part of Vietnam. And this whole policy issue are some of the internal context that was actually preventing the North Vietnamese or the communist government from establishing total control over Vietnam. Now, the other situation was, of course, the prosecution of the Catholics. Many of the Catholics went away from the north. They went to the south, and that was allowed under the Geneva Peace Accord. So because of the Western educated Catholics migration, it created the impression that the northern Vietnam was actually a very oppressive government. And the shortage of administrative staff, because most of the Catholics are mostly so-called Western educated, they are the ones who are more better in skills in running of administration, the migration of the Catholic led to the shortage of educated manpower in the north, and that also affected its administration. Now, again, I want to re-emphasize on your understanding of communism. The belief of communism is that everybody is equal, and as a result of that equality, okay, there is actually a very the idea of so-called religion doesn't play a big role in so-called the communist ideology. So because of that, okay, the immigration of the Catholic, although it was allowed under the Geneva Accord, gave the impression that the North was actually oppressive. But is it actually that the situation? Nobody is actually quite convinced by that. Okay, so what were the other things that was happening at that point of time? Okay, another issue that was happening was that there was a lot of unhappiness towards Dim. Now, during the last lesson, I mentioned to you that Dim was a dictator. He was somebody who is practicing nepotism, meaning he actually supported his own people, and he abuses his power by purging many of his opponents. So there was a lot of discontentment leading to the coup, and of course leading to what we call his assassination. And the result of his assassination meant that there was political instability in the south. What you have here, a picture, this is actually the assassination of Dim. Okay, this assassination of Dim, and that was his body. And what is this situation over here? Now, remember I mentioned to you there was a lot of unhappiness towards Dim. Now, this man is a very respected monk. Okay, very respected monk in southern Vietnam, and he got someone to drive him to a marketplace, and then he started to douse himself with kerosene, and he set himself on fire to show his unhappiness and discontentment towards him. Of course, in the process, he died. He died in the process of the fire. To, and this car, interestingly, can still be found in the museum, in one of the museum. If I'm not mistaken, it was a military museum, and it was on display. And this car was actually a very important historical artifact because this was the one who actually drove this monk over to the marketplace where he actually doused himself on fire to show his unhappiness towards him. Okay, so you could see that there was a lot of tension. There was a lot of discontentment towards Dim, and that also shows the instability in the southern part of Vietnam. Now, the next thing that we're going to look at is this idea of the containment policy that was going on. Now, if you remember, in the 1950s, late 50s, after the Geneva Accord, the Americans came in and replaced the French to help to prop up the Southern Vietnam democratic government. And the reason why the Americans were doing that was because they were practicing this thing called the containment policy. That was in line with what was happening in the world itself. Now, as the situation comes in, they believe the Americans came in, okay, and I found a very interesting article. Okay, it's actually a very short excerpt, but there was this writer who wrote about who mentioned about it and says that the Americans did not really understand what was happening at this point of time. When they came in to try to stop the war, they came in and think that it was this idea of a proxy war. They came in fighting a proxy war. But what they didn't understand was that there was never a civil war in the first place. The people were largely supportive of nationalism. They were supportive of Ho Chi Minh. So the Americans came in fighting a proxy war. The Vietnamese came in trying to get rid of America. So it was not fighting a war of communist versus democracy. It was a war of nationalism, meaning the communists was fighting a war of nationalism because they were trying to throw out the American, because the American was seen as external so-called invaders of the country. So I want you to understand this context very, very clearly because it was a little bit different from the Korean situation. The Korean situation is that both sides of the government have their supporters, and the American came in, um, support Americans, and the Chinese came in to support what we call a civil war, and that has escalated into some form of a mini proxy war. But in the case of the Vietnamese, it was a little bit different. The Vietnamese was fighting against the American as a nationalist is fighting against a foreign invader. Can you understand that context so far? So there's a very, very interesting fine line that was going on. And therefore, the communists, or should I say the Vietnamese, Ho Chi Minh, the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, when they were creating problems for the Americans found themselves realizing that they don't understand what was going on in the local context and the how very strong desire for independence. Now, to be very, very honest, the Americans actually didn't lose the war. The Americans, in fact, fenced off all the attacks that the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong was doing. Okay, in the northern part or in the southern part of Vietnam, okay, wherever Tet offensive or even all those small scale attacks, the Americans were able to defeat the Vietnamese. But the problem was the Vietnamese was that they were very persistent. They continued to create problems for the Americans. And that was why, at the end of it, the war became very, very costly and it became very unpopular because the Americans started to, the American press, like for example, just now that movie that I showed you on Hearts and Minds, these are some of the propaganda instruments that were being sent back to America to tell the Americans that they are fighting a open and close inverted comma losing war, a war that is costly, a war that is unpopular. And that created a lot of anti-Vietnam War sentiment. The 1970s were also a period of time when there was this rise of what we call the hippie culture. What is this hippie culture? This hippie culture in America are those people who believe in, you know, uh, make make love not war type of mentality. There are people the Americans who believe in what taking of drugs, uh, believe in living life to the fullest, and they do not believe in using of violence. They want to make peace. They believe in living life um, um, in a very peaceful manner, and therefore the war was actually something that was highly unpopular. So as a result of this, and in the 1970s, the American situation, okay, towards the Cold War have also started to decrease. The President Richard Nixon, okay, continues the policy that was going on in the American containment policy, and what they did was that they started to slow down this whole arms race or hostilities and suspicion. And therefore, the Cold War went into this period, which I already mentioned to you before, period of détente. Okay, period of détente. That means easing of relationship. And because of the easing of relationship, there was also something that was happening, which you can read it up a little bit more, was that Russia and China also started to have bad relationship with one another. Okay, China and Russia started to have bad relationship with one another, and China started to distance itself from Russia, and they also started to improve relationship with America. And that was when I mentioned to you about this ping pong diplomacy that was going on. Okay, remember the last lesson, a few lessons ago, I talked about this using game to try to build up good relationship, and table tennis was one of the way that they actually do so. So this resulted to a agreement in Shanghai where the American was asked to negotiate a settlement with the Vietnamese with the help of the Chinese. So the Chinese act as the middleman in order to broker a so-called an agreement where the Americans will now commit to do a form of negotiated settlement with the Vietnamese. Okay, so I mentioned to you there was a lot of anti-war sentiment okay, after the Tet Offensive, because um, there was a lot of unhappiness that was going on, okay, because they witnessed the type of violence that was going on, that was happening in America. Now, because this topic is not going to be examinable, I also choose to reduce the number of things I wanted to share with you. But if you were to do a Google search, you will notice that there was a lot of horrifying pictures, okay, about the treatment that the Americans were also doing in order to force the Vietnamese to surrender. Some of these Vietnamese were very, very resilient, and the Americans make use of many different ways of trying to force them to surrender, sometimes using all forms of torture. Okay, I wanted to share with you some pictures, but I decided not to in the interest of time. But one of the things that I when I went to the War Museum in Vietnam, in southern part of Vietnam, in Ho Chi Minh City or Saigon, present day Ho Chi Minh City. Now last time was known as Saigon. When we went to the War Museum, there were different instruments of torture that the Americans were doing. Okay, the things like, for example, the familiar thing about the drowning, and then there was also one that they locked this person into a small square, okay, which was about the size of a, for example, size of a mattress. Okay, can you imagine your bedding mattress, and imagine this was a cage that you're locked inside. So you are actually placed in the hot sun or in the open, and you are succumbed to the hot sun or rain, and then they will just put you there out for days to so-called to dry you, to let the rain fall on you, and after days they will force you to surrender, or to tell them about the guerrilla attacks that the Viet Cong was doing. Some of them even went to the extreme of taking pliers to pull out the teeth of these so-called Vietnamese Viet Cong soldiers or supporters, in order to force them to surrender, or force them to review what was happening in terms of the war itself. So there was a lot of horrible things. And of course, one of the worst things that the Americans were also doing was Agent Orange. Agent Orange operation is actually the dropping of this form of pesticide, which will actually create biological effects on the body. People who receive, is actually a combination of napalm, and when it is dropped onto the skin, it will create a burning situation. And then when all these things, so-called pesticides, or all these things are being consumed, it will also create abnormally. For example, people who are born blind, or people who are born with no limbs, etc. So there was a lot of horrifying pictures, but I think I'll leave it to you to go and take a look if you want to research a little bit more for tomorrow's lesson. Okay, so with that, we've come to the end of today's lesson. Okay, I know it's a very, very short lesson today, but what I wanted to do was to actually to wrap up today's lesson, to actually share with you what are the things that's happening with regards to the defeat of the Americans. Now, I just want to highlight this very, very interesting situation to all of you. When we come to the war in Vietnam, okay, although it's a very, very long lasting war, it is a long war, but this whole entire war was actually a victory in the form of the Vietnamese. But I would not put it as it was a defeat for the Americans. If the Americans were to persist and to continue to hold on and continue to fight the war, chances are they will be able to fence off the Vietnamese, although it may not have the popular support. But one of the most important things that I also want you to take note of is that at this point of time, do understand the key difference between the Korean War and the Vietnam War. And I want you to also think about it in a very, very different context. What happened if the Korean War did, for example, what if the Korean War did happen around the same period of time as the Vietnam War? would the American have done all those things to try to protect Korea? Okay, you think about it. If let's say it happened somewhere also in the 1960s and the 1970s, would the American continue to protect? So if we change the con context and we change it from Vietnam War to Korean War, would the war still be something like this? Will Korea still be divided into two countries? Okay, I want to burst the bubble a little bit. Okay, but if I were to see this situation, chances are that North Korea would have defeated South Korea. North Korea would have defeated South Korea, and at that point of time, when that happened, okay, you may have a total communist Korea, which sadly to say for many of you, there goes your K-pop, K-drama idol, because chances are you won't even see them at all, because the whole entire Korea would have become a um, communist country. Okay, if you remember what happened in the Korean War, the southern part of Korea was actually unable to fence against the northern part of Korea. So it's the same situation. So therefore, it's something for you to take note of. Okay. Now, change the context a little bit also. If North Korea, sorry, North and South Vietnam situation happened in the early phases, would we still have a united Vietnam? Or will Vietnam still end up in this present situation? Okay. Bearing in mind there wasn't a demarcation, bearing in mind that the Americans are going to make sure that there is going to be some form of stability going on um, in order to end off the war. Would the French would have stayed there? There's a lot of big if question. But I think the most important thing is to understand the historical context that was happening at that point of time. That will give you a bigger idea about what was happening here. Okay. Now, I don't want to continue to go into the analysis. The sad thing is that the events are already over. The good thing is that Vietnam is now a united country, and at the same time, they are also opening up their economic development. In fact, Vietnam economy is also doing very, very well. So even though they are a communist country, you notice that there's a lot of avenues, there's a lot of growth in terms of economy. I think the people themselves, life are also getting better. So I think that's a good thing. So with this, we officially come to the end of our syllabus that you're supposed to learn for your pure history. Okay, I have a last piece of work for you to analyze this lesson. It is something for you to do a research on. It should be in your SLS tomorrow. Go and work on it. Okay, something is really a self-directed SLS learning. But I encourage you. I know, guys, I know that y'all are very adverse to work, but I encourage you to take that tomorrow time to either watch the video that I gave you on Google Classroom, or go and research a little bit about the atrocity that the Americans were doing. Something that I failed to share with you today, because I think there's a lot of things, but I think it's a good thing to wrap up this whole entire chapter. Okay, so I will be giving a piece of holiday homework. I'll be sending it all to you over the SLS by end of the week. And please complete this as a hard copy, because I will be collecting from all of you. Hopefully, finger crossed. Okay, hopefully we will go back to school on the 4th of June. Then I'll get to see every single one of you. Okay, I'm really looking forward to that. Okay, so this is my last Zoom lesson with all of you for before your May holiday. Have a good rest. Okay, um, stay safe, stay healthy, and please continue to regain the momentum, because when we come back, as I was sharing with Kevin before the lesson, you don't have a lot of time when you come back. By week 4, where we start our intensive revision, week 1 to 3, you're going to have your mother tongue intensive revision. Week 4, all the way to about maybe about week 10 or 11, which is maybe about 6 weeks. That will be the intensive revision that you're going to have for your O level, and then you're going to have a prelim. That will happen in about week maybe 11 or 12. Okay, by week 13, which is the last week, effectively nothing's going to happen because there is Teachers' Day celebration, and then it is term 4 already. So you don't really have a lot of time. So do spend that time to do your revision, okay, and get yourself ready for your lesson. Okay, I want to tell you there was a mistake that I made yesterday. I forgot to do a recording, but this lesson I've actually recorded. I will send you the YouTube link in a short while. Okay, so with that, we'll come to the end of today's lesson. Okay, if you want to clarify certain things or you just want to have a chit chat with me before you start on doing other things, then you can stay behind. If not, then the rest of you are now free to exit the group. Okay, I will see you again in June. Okay, take care and rest well.
Sure. The slides you posted on SLS, like for lesson 2, it's the same as lesson 1.
Is it? So I posted the
Yeah.
wrong slide, is it? Okay.
I think so.
You should be able to look at it from the Google Classroom. Okay, look at the Google Classroom. The one
okay.
I put out the slide of the Google Classroom. Okay, so you take a look at that. It should be the things I'll go. If there's any error, just let me know again. Okay?
Mr.
Okay, okay.
Yes.
How is it that